Hey, your viewers and viewers, my name is General Red Strategist, and welcome back to So You're Being Hunted. This is episode 552. So, back here, of course, on our previous world from the previous map. We're just having another podcast-style episode whilst I play through and get some more device pieces and all that, because why the heck not? Basically, I was thinking, shall I start a challenge? Shall I not? But, nah. Basically, I just think I need a bit of filler content for Sir in the meantime. This is usually how I start a lot of my videos for So You're Being Hunted at the moment, saying, I was thinking about doing a challenge, but then, oh no, actually, I decided just to do another podcast style episode because I needed filler and all that, just to keep the channel tiding over in the meantime. Which, you know what, that's fine. I mean, the thing is, like, it's been a while since I did proper playthroughs of Sir and all that, so I think a few episodes like this, they don't hurt at all, do they? They're fine, ladies and gentlemen. I know you all do still like and enjoy watching the So You're Being Hunted series and listening to me ramble aimlessly and without any real sort of direction about various topics and all that. So yeah, we'll just keep going for the time being. So it's a Monday afternoon as we record this, late in the afternoon that is. Work's done for the day, so I'm chilling out. Basically, just relaxing and all that. Now, thing is, I actually do have a thing that's kind of on my mind at the moment, and it's a random change of topic from sort of things that I've been talking about recently. So, thing is, I always, as I've said before, I always every so often just like to talk about things that I've been watching on YouTube, things that I've encountered by ways of videos, channels, things like that. And recently I mentioned a H-Bomber guy in his videos on YouTube, mainly the one about vaccines and the whole anti-vax movement, and obviously Andrew Wakefield and stuff like that. Great video. You should go and watch it. It's a very effective and thorough deconstruction of everything that was basically wrong about Andrew Wakefield and the whole anti-vax movement. I mean, I know it may be sort of preaching to the converted a little bit, but if you're an absolute empiricist and very scientifically minded, it will basically reinforce for you the absolute value of really sort of critically engaging with a lot of the anti-vax movement claims, particularly in relation to Wakefield's discredited paper on vaccines, bowel problems and autism and all that. So I still very much recommend that, definitely. But another interesting channel that I encountered recently is just called Shaun, Shaun. It's similar to H-Bomber Guy in that he takes a lot of like topical sort of issues here on the internet, especially ones to do with things like culture wars and things like that. And he really does a good job of sort of deconstructing them, and particularly, and again, I don't mean to sort of single out people of a particular political leaning here, but he does a very good job at deconstructing claims made by the alt-right and groups like that. So, yeah, another good channel, but he doesn't just sort of deconstruct political stuff. He also talks about other more, well, I was about to say non-political subjects, not so much non-political as ones that are not necessarily directed at particular political groups, but which are directed at certain topics, but which do touch on issues that are deep down ultimately political. And one of Shaun's videos from a couple of years back, which I watched recently, it's over an hour, it's about an hour and 40 something minutes, 44, 45 minutes, something like that. So it's a fairly long one. Apologies, by the way, if you can hear my washing machine going in the background. It shouldn't be too loud. I should have actually knocked my door shut before I started recording. I'll just do that now. And just close that door so it obscures some of the noise. But that actually makes my voice suddenly sound like it's now reverbing off the walls of my little office space. Let me just actually, you know what, fuck it, I'm just going to have the door slightly open, so that way it doesn't sound like my voice is reverbing and all that, and I'll, if that causes a bit of sound from my washing machine in the background, then screw it. Trade-offs and all that. I probably should have put my washing machine on much earlier in the day, so it was done by the time I did this, but never mind. Right, what was I talking about? I was talking about this channel, Shaun. So he did a very interesting video about Harry Potter. Now, Harry Potter is a subject that I think has only really cropped up once before here on my So You're Being Hunted series. I think I did a video where me and Phil read out that sort of AI-written Harry Potter story. Do you remember that, ladies and gents? But that was very much us poking fun at an AI written story. It wasn't really so much about Harry Potter itself. But the thing about Harry Potter is, the Sean video, if you've not seen it, was really interesting. I think it's literally just called Harry Potter, the video. But basically, it's a real sort of long, extensive deconstruction of everything that's kind of wrong about Harry Potter. And thing is, I'm not talking here about, more sort of recent topical debates around sort of J.K. Rowling's attitudes towards, say, like the trans community, stuff like that. I'm just talking about, if anything, it's more about sort of like the quality of the writing in the Harry Potter books. And the thing is, here's the thing, right? When I was a kid, I grew up at a time when the Harry Potter, books were being published, and like many kids at that time, I was reading them, and I did enjoy them as a kid. But of course, thing about me is I don't think I've ever really talked about this before, but I haven't read all the Harry Potter books. I think I've read the first 6 of them, but I never read the 7th one, because by the time the 7th one came out, I think I was just getting too old. I was in my teenage years and I just wasn't interested anymore. But so the thing is, the first couple of Harry Potter books, when you're a kid, they are what they are. They're sort of, just tales of whimsy, magic, adventure, things like that. But what's kind of fascinating is, as an adult, I've seen a lot of people talking about how when you sort of really think about a lot of what goes on in the Harry Potter stories, you actually end up kind of seeing them in a completely different light to how you saw them when you were a kid. And, I don't necessarily have to go back and reread them to actually see that myself, because, let's be honest, there's a lot in the Harry Potter books that doesn't actually make sense when you really stop to think about it. Because, like, some of the writing just is either not very good or it's not very satisfying. So, from what I understand, like, I'm not just talking here about the 7th Harry Potter book and how it ends, because apparently, by all accounts, it's a very disappointing ending. But the Sean video that I watched just does such a good job of kind of deconstructing, like, the writing and some of, like, the plot issues in the stories. Well worth a watch, like I said, if you're interested. And in essence, the problem with, like, J.K. Rowling is, apparently she's just not very good at world building. That's her problem. She introduces a lot of things and elements in her stories which you think are going to be sort of significant later down the line in terms of plot points that are going to be resolved or are going to be addressed, but then which ultimately never actually are. So, like, the big one I think that probably everyone thinks about is the fact that in the Harry Potter universe they have house elf slavery, that sort of thing. Because you think basically this is a world where clearly, there are some, how should we say, racial and class issues in terms of, wizards see themselves as superior to everything else. And so, like, house elves are, like, right down at the bottom of the pecking order. They are basically slaves. And you'd think that, if you're setting that up as part of your world, you'd think that at some point in the story, maybe the protagonist is going to address that, and he's going to think, maybe this slavery system that we've got going on in our society, maybe this is just a bit problematic, morally speaking. But from what I understand, and, I will concede, like I said, I've never read the 7th Harry Potter book, but from everything I've heard from people who have, and people who've seen, obviously, the Harry Potter movies, by all accounts, it never gets resolved. There's no kind of payoff. It's just like something that's introduced in the world and then never really addressed. And it's not just the house elf slavery thing, because from the books that I did read as a kid, I can remember other plot points in the Harry Potter world, which, when I look back on them, I think to myself, there's a real sort of moral conundrum in there that J.K. Rowling just never addresses. So, like, the other big one is the status of centaurs in the Harry Potter universe. So, centaurs are not enslaved, but the wizards very much treat them as being kind of a lesser species, and as a result, centaurs are kind of, like, confined to essentially designated areas of the wizarding world. And the thing is, if you have any sort of knowledge of history, you probably will there immediately see a kind of an eerie parallel with a real world example, namely Native American communities and the way they were placed onto reservations, things like that. They had lands taken away from them, and then they were just sort of given areas to live and said, this is where you live. So, yeah, that's something else. Another sort of example of kind of, I suppose, what you would call a systemic injustice in the sort of Harry Potter world's society. But it's a plot point, again, that just never really gets addressed all that much, or is never resolved, to put it that way. And it's curious, because I think this is where a lot of criticisms of J.K. Rowling as an author kind of come from. Because, at the very minimum, it's kind of like, you could say, a bit lazy writing, introducing all these points. Well, not necessarily lazy writing. It could be lazy writing, or it could just be that J.K. is just not as good of a writer as sometimes she's been sort of praised as being, because it suggests either she's lazy and doesn't want to resolve the plot points, or she maybe just doesn't know how to resolve them. And, yeah, it's just like, at worst, though, it raises questions about the author's own views, because there are people out there who do sort of say, look, if you compare this with other books that J.K. Rowling has written, and the big example of that is a book like The Casual Vacancy, there is an argument to be made that J.K. Rowling is sort of kind of not... is kind of exemplifying a certain attitude, politically speaking, which is that rather than necessarily changing injustices, we should instead work within the status quo. But that the problem with working within the status quo means that sometimes certain issues get swept under the rug rather than changed. I'm probably not explaining this very well. I think the Sean video that I mentioned a moment ago actually does a far better job of explaining it. But yeah, it's things like this. And I mean, you know, I've just given a couple of examples there about house elves, about centaurs and things like this in the Harry Potter universe. But there's other things we can talk about. Like, you know, going back to the house elf slavery thing, and I do remember this when I read the Harry Potter books. I think it was the third book, wasn't it? Prisoner, what's it called? Prisoner of I was about to say Prisoner of Azerbaijan. That's not right. Prisoner of Azkaban, that's it. God, it took me a second then. It's been so long. Yeah, I think it's the third book, Prisoner of Azkaban, where obviously I think Hermione learns for the first time that Hogwarts has house elves working in the kitchens and things like that, and she sets up basically what's essentially her little society that she tries to set up for the promotion of what is essentially house elf rights. And what's always fascinating about that is how, when you look back on it, what Hermione is promoting there is a very moral cause, you know, campaigning against what is effectively slavery. But it's interesting how the books kind of handle it, the way the author, J.K. Rowling, sort of handles it. Basically, it becomes something to laugh at, and it's quite fascinating to see how Hermione is just sort of shouted down by all the other characters and laughed at and sneered at by all the other cast members, including her friends, like Ron and Harry, Ron particularly, from what I remember. And it's funny how the name of her little society for campaigning for elves' rights is itself a pun. Spew. Was it like Society for Promotion of Elf Welfare or something? Or Elvish Welfare? I can't remember exactly what it was. It was something like that, though. But yeah, it's like, it's weird when you look back on it like that. And the thing is, it's like, obviously, people have made sort of counter-arguments about the whole thing. Well, you know, in the books they make it clear that the house elves like being enslaved. They like working for the wizards and all this. But that shouldn't really matter, because slavery is still slavery, right? Even if you're treating your slaves humanely, surely that doesn't matter, because you're still defending a system that essentially reduces certain people to the status of property, that essentially isn't really treating them as actual people with rights and feelings and interests. So, like I say, the whole counter-argument that people have made about how house elves, you know, like slavery, and how not everyone treats house elves badly, that's not really a defence, is it? Because it's still slavery, like I say. And, you know, this is a point that I think the Sean video made quite eloquently. So there's that aspect of it, which is fascinating. And then, you know, you get onto the myriad of other lesser sort of plot points, which don't really make a lot of sense. Like, for example, how in the Wizarding world they have various means of teleportation, and yet they still insist on using owls to deliver their mail, even though owls are one of the slowest birds on Earth. And in fact, most owls are not really evolved for long distance flying. Just seems really fucking odd, doesn't it? Almost like the world building doesn't really make a lot of sense when you actually poke holes in it. And like other ones that I've seen people talking about, for example, is the way Hagrid is imprisoned in Azkaban in book 2, I think it was, Chamber of Secrets. And yet, you know, they have truth potions and things like that. They could very easily try and use that to verify the truth of whatever they're accusing someone of. And yet, no, they don't. Like with Sirius Black in book 3, for instance. Now, obviously there are counters to that. You could argue that, well, corruption is a thing, clearly, in the Harry Potter world, so even if you have things like truth potions, that's not to say that there might not be some, like, corruption, bit of double dealing somewhere that could result in someone innocent being sent down for a crime they didn't commit. And, you know, well, I'll concede that. That's true. That's absolutely true. But yeah, there's just things like that where a bit of explanation would help. The other big thing that I think was interesting from the Sean video was how you have a family like the Weasleys who are clearly, you know, impoverished and don't have a lot of money. And then you have Harry, who comes along, discovers he actually does have a lot of money in his Gringotts bank account, and yet doesn't really seem to do anything with his money to actually make a lasting difference to the lives of his friends. Now, not to sound like a bit of a socialist here, but, you know, I think that's a fair point, isn't it? So, yeah, something else there about, I suppose, class and poverty and our attitudes towards it and all that. Sorry, I just heard someone banging around in one of the other flats. Hope you didn't hear that, ladies and gentlemen. But yeah, that too. In fact, actually, speaking of money and stuff like that, no, there's another point, come to think of it, that has often been discussed in the Harry Potter universe. The way goblins are depicted. So this is something which I never picked up on as a kid, probably because I was never aware of it, but there's been a lot of accusations that the goblins are kind of an anti-Semitic stereotype, because if you look at the way they're physically depicted, yeah, it's a bit problematic. So that's a thing, just to be aware of. Yes. In fact, you know, that Sean video, sorry, I keep going back to it, but it was a good video. It was really thought-provoking and interesting to watch and sort of listen to these different views on the subject. In fact, the Sean video kind of talks a lot about how J.K. Rowling often uses physical traits as a way of kind of setting up whether characters are good or bad or untrustworthy, as though it essentially all comes down to you can tell the bad guys because they're ugly or they're fat or whatever, which is always, you know, a bit yikes when you really stop and think about it. And I think the Sean video really had quite an interesting and thought-provoking way of putting it, which was that in Harry Potter there are no good or bad actions. Instead, there are just good and bad teams. So it doesn't matter whether the good or the bad team is acting in a way that is actually morally questionable, you know, because that's not the thing you're using to actually measure who's good and who's bad. Quite often it comes down to, well, you know, these guys are the bad guys clearly because, you know, they're disfigured, or they have, you know, tattoos, or they're overweight and they're ugly, or whatever. Whereas, you know, the good guys are pretty normal looking people. Things like this. So it's just like, really? Yikes. And, you know, there may well be sort of exceptions to that rule. For example, like Hagrid being a half-giant, I think, and things like that. Big shaggy bearded half-giant. But, I don't know, it feels like he is very much the exception rather than the norm. So, yeah, I mean, there's probably, you know, like I say, exceptions to the rule, points of minor debate, and things like that. But God, yeah, it was a really interesting video to watch, and it is well worth a watch, whatever you think of the Harry Potter I said Harry Potter videos, Harry Potter books and films. But God, yeah, it was really good. Just thought-provoking, ladies and gentlemen. Right, I've been recording for probably a decent amount of time there, so I think I'll probably do for an episode. And since someone is really knocking on one of the ceilings, something, probably doing some hammering work on a carpet, I think I'll wrap up here before that starts distracting everyone too much. Alright, ladies and gentlemen, thanks very much. Facebook and Twitter links down below, along with the link to my propagandist channel for anyone interested. If you enjoyed, a like is of course always appreciated. Other than that, I'm signing off now. Goodbye all. Come on. There we go, we're doing it. Gotcha. These shower cubicles? No. Lock room. Check them all. Oh, told you there'd be someone there. Well, I didn't, but you know what I mean? Oh my god, did someone leave a floater? Not anymore. No one's in that one. Bonk. Shit. Gotcha. Shit. Woof. Just keep kicking the door open. Don't blow up on me, bud. Nobody there? Shit! That's a lot of enemies!